It was a quiet evening in the summer of 2007 when the kind of tragedy that would haunt a small Illinois town for years first unfolded. At the time, no one could have imagined that this case, buried beneath layers of silence, missed opportunities, and unanswered questions, would take nearly 2 decades to finally unravel. But when the truth emerged and an arrest was made, the shockwaves ripped through the community like a storm no one saw coming. Her name was Alyssa Monroe, a name that would, in time, become known to every household in her small Illinois town. In 2007, Alyssa was only 25 years old, full of youth and possibility. She had a quiet grace about her, the kind that made people feel at ease in her presence. Her friends described her as thoughtful, her co-workers remembered her as hardworking, and her family knew her as the glue that kept everyone close. Alyssa grew up in the same town where she would later vanish. Her childhood home sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees, a modest 2-story house with a porch swing her father had built by hand. She was the eldest of 3 children, with a younger brother named Evan and a sister named Claire. Their mother, Judith, worked as a nurse at the local clinic, and their father, Frank, had been a mechanic who often brought his children into the garage to teach them the basics of fixing cars. The Monroe family was well liked in the community, not flashy or wealthy but steady and kind. From a young age, Alyssa showed a natural curiosity for people. She loved to ask questions, to understand what others were feeling, and she often offered comfort in ways that went beyond her years. In high school, she joined the debate team, played volleyball, and volunteered at the local library where she read stories to children. She was not the loudest voice in the room, but she was one of the most respected. After graduation, Alyssa pursued her dream of becoming a teacher. She enrolled in a state university and earned a degree in elementary education. By 2007, she was working at Jefferson Elementary School, teaching a class of 3rd graders. Her classroom was decorated with colorful drawings and motivational posters, and she often stayed late to help students who were struggling. Colleagues said she had a gift for patience, an ability to make children believe in themselves when no one else did. But Alyssa's life was not only about work. She loved hiking in the state park just outside town, often taking long walks to clear her mind. She had a close circle of friends with whom she spent Friday evenings at the local diner, sharing milkshakes and laughing about small-town gossip. She also had a serious boyfriend, Daniel Whitaker, who worked at a nearby construction company. They had been dating for over a year, and many expected Daniel would soon propose. Her family remembered Alyssa as someone who carried light with her wherever she went. She never missed her siblings' milestones, whether it was Evan's high school football games or Claire's art shows. She kept a journal where she wrote about her dreams of one day traveling abroad, seeing the world beyond Illinois. But at her core, she remained deeply rooted in her community. She loved the safety of knowing her neighbors, the comfort of familiar places, and the feeling that this town would always be home. And that is why her disappearance was so deeply unsettling. Alyssa was not someone who would run away. She was not reckless, not involved in dangerous habits, not the type to vanish without explanation. To everyone who knew her, Alyssa was dependable, steady, and trustworthy. Her sudden absence created an ache that was impossible to ignore. On the morning of the day she disappeared, Alyssa had woken early, made coffee, and called her mother to remind her about Claire's upcoming birthday. She taught her usual classes at school, smiling as her students handed her crayon-colored drawings of animals and rainbows. After school, she met a friend for a quick dinner and then drove home. That was the last normal day her family would ever remember. The tragedy of Alyssa's story lies not only in the crime itself, but in the bright promise of the life that was stolen. She was a young woman who had dedicated herself to helping children, who dreamed of building a family of her own, who believed in the good of people. In the years that followed, her picture would appear in newspapers, on missing posters, and in the hearts of everyone who whispered her name. When investigators later pieced together her final hours, they would struggle to understand how someone so beloved could become the victim of such a cruel fate. Her family clung to her memory, her friends mourned the loss of her laughter, and her students carried the faint memory of a teacher who once made them feel safe and cared for. In a town where everyone thought they knew each other, Alyssa Monroe's disappearance shattered the illusion of safety. She was not just another face in the crowd, she was the daughter of a nurse, the sister of 2 younger siblings, the teacher every child adored. Her absence left a hole that nothing could fill, and as the years dragged on without answers, the pain only deepened. And so, when the case finally broke open years later, when justice at last began to take shape, the story of Alyssa Monroe would remind everyone why they never stopped searching for the truth. Because Alyssa was more than just a victim in a file. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a teacher whose memory deserved to be honored with answers. June 14, 2007 began like any other summer day in the small Illinois town. The sun rose over the quiet streets, casting long golden rays across the sidewalks where children pedaled bicycles and dogs barked at passing cars. Alyssa Monroe spent the morning with her students at Jefferson Elementary, teaching multiplication tables and reading a story about a family of explorers. By the time the final school bell rang, she was smiling and waving goodbye to her class, unaware that this day would be the last anyone saw her alive. After school, Alyssa met her friend, Rebecca Lawson, at the town's favorite diner. They ordered sandwiches and iced tea, laughing about their week and making plans for the weekend. Around 7 p.m., Alyssa said her goodbyes and promised to call Rebecca the next day. She walked to her car, a silver Honda Civic parked along Main Street, and drove toward her small apartment on the edge of town. But somewhere between the bustle of downtown and the quiet stretch of county road that led to her home, Alyssa Monroe disappeared. When she failed to show up for work the following morning, her absence raised immediate concern. Alyssa was known for her punctuality and sense of responsibility. She would never leave her students waiting. By noon, her colleagues began making calls, and when her family learned she had not returned home the night before, they contacted the police. Officers began canvassing the area, retracing Alyssa's steps from the diner to her apartment. Within hours, they made a discovery that would turn the case into a nightmare. Her car was found abandoned along a desolate stretch of county road just 3 miles from her home. The driver's door was unlocked and the keys were still in the ignition. Inside the vehicle lay her purse, cell phone, and teaching bag. Nothing appeared stolen. The eerie detail that unsettled investigators most was the driver's seat. It had been pushed far back as though someone much taller than Alyssa had been sitting behind the wheel. This small clue suggested she had not been the last person to operate her car. The area where the vehicle was found was isolated. Cornfields stretched out on both sides, the tall stalks swaying under the heavy summer air. At night, the road was poorly lit, nearly swallowed in darkness, and only the occasional passing truck disturbed the silence. To the officers on the scene, it felt like the perfect place for someone to make a young woman disappear without being seen. As word spread, members of the community rushed to help. Volunteers combed the fields, searching for any sign of Alyssa. Neighbors opened barns, sheds, and backyards, hoping she had somehow sought refuge nearby. But the search yielded little. The only other clue came from faint tire tracks leading into the edge of the cornfield, as though another vehicle had briefly pulled off the road before vanishing into the night. By the third day, the local sheriff's office called in state investigators. Cadaver dogs were deployed, helicopters circled overhead, and divers checked nearby ponds. Each hour that passed without finding Alyssa deepened the dread. The Monroe family held press conferences, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Her mother's voice trembled as she begged, "If you know where my daughter is, please help us bring her home." Then came the discovery that shifted the investigation from a missing persons case to a suspected homicide. On June 18, just 4 days after Alyssa was last seen, a farmer checking his property stumbled upon a chilling sight at the edge of his field. Beneath the cover of thick brush lay Alyssa's body. She had been carefully concealed, as if someone had tried to ensure she would never be found. The scene was harrowing. Alyssa's clothing was torn, and there were visible injuries that suggested she had fought back against her attacker. The coroner later confirmed she had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The brutality of the act, combined with the deliberate attempt to hide her remains, sent a wave of shock through the town. Investigators scoured the area for evidence. They collected soil samples, fibers, and footprints. They also noted cigarette butts near the body, though Alyssa herself was not a smoker. Every detail seemed to suggest that the killer had lingered there, perhaps watching to make sure his crime would remain hidden. The news of Alyssa's death shattered the community. Candlelight vigils were held outside the school where she taught. Students placed flowers and handwritten notes on her empty desk. Parents clutched their children tighter, fearing that the person who had killed a beloved teacher might still be roaming free. For the Monroe family, the discovery was devastating. Hope that Alyssa might return alive had been crushed, replaced by the torment of knowing her final moments had been filled with terror. Her father stood before reporters with tears in his eyes, saying, "No one deserves this. My daughter was the kindest soul you could ever meet. Whoever did this, we will not stop until you are found." The crime scene had provided some evidence but no clear suspect. And as days turned into weeks, the initial surge of activity slowed. The cornfields grew taller, the search parties dwindled, and the case that had once consumed the entire town slowly began to slip into uncertainty. Still, the abandoned car, the tire tracks, the cigarette butts, and the hidden body would remain frozen in time, clues waiting for the day when someone would finally put the pieces together. In the days following the discovery of Alyssa Monroe's body, the town of Brookhaven, Illinois, became the epicenter of a desperate investigation. Patrol cars lined the county road where her car had been found, reporters swarmed the Monroe family's home, and investigators pored over every detail from the crime scene. For the community, it was unthinkable that someone capable of such brutality could be walking among them. For the police, it was a race against time to catch a killer before he vanished back into the shadows. The first step was to secure the immediate area. Crime scene tape fluttered against the summer wind as investigators combed through the field where Alyssa's body had been discovered. They collected soil samples, photographed tire tracks, and bagged every cigarette butt they could find. Forensic teams dusted her car for fingerprints and swabbed surfaces for DNA. The vehicle was towed to the state crime lab, where specialists examined it under bright lights, searching for hidden fibers or traces of blood. At first, detectives were optimistic. They believed the sheer volume of evidence would quickly narrow down suspects. But optimism soon gave way to frustration. The fingerprints lifted from Alyssa's car belonged only to her and her family. The cigarette butts, though carefully preserved, yielded partial DNA profiles that did not match anyone in the state database. And the tire tracks near the cornfield, though clear, could only be linked to a common brand of pickup truck tires, far too vague to identify a single vehicle. With physical evidence stalling, detectives turned to interviews. They started with those closest to Alyssa. Her boyfriend, Daniel Whitaker, was questioned extensively. Investigators asked about their relationship, their last conversation, and whether they had argued. Daniel admitted that he and Alyssa had discussed their future that week, but he insisted there had been no conflict. His alibi checked out. He had been working late on a construction site the night Alyssa vanished, and several co-workers confirmed his presence. Next came Alyssa's friend, Rebecca Lawson, the last person to see her alive. Rebecca recalled their dinner at the diner in vivid detail, even remembering the exact time Alyssa walked to her car. Rebecca said Alyssa seemed happy and calm, with no indication she felt threatened. She also noted that Alyssa had waved to an older man near the parking lot, a detail investigators found intriguing. However, security cameras from nearby shops were grainy and failed to capture the man's face. Neighbors from Alyssa's apartment complex were also interviewed. One recalled hearing a car door slam late that night, while another claimed to have seen headlights lingering near the entrance to the county road. But none of the testimonies provided a clear lead. The investigation expanded to known offenders in the area. Detectives compiled a list of men with histories of violence or harassment. They questioned ex-boyfriends, disgruntled acquaintances, and even strangers who had crossed paths with Alyssa in recent months. While some raised suspicion initially, each was eventually cleared. As the weeks dragged on, frustration mounted. The Monroe family grew restless, holding vigils and pleading with authorities to keep the case alive. Community members pressured the sheriff's department, demanding progress. Local newspapers ran headlines like, "No Answers in Monroe Murder," and "Brookhaven Living in Fear." Behind closed doors, tensions ran high among investigators. Some believed the crime was random, a predator passing through town who struck when the opportunity arose. Others argued it had to be someone local, someone who knew Alyssa's routines. The lack of forced entry into her car, the presence of her belongings untouched, and the way her body was concealed all suggested a level of familiarity with the area. Still, without hard evidence, the case began to lose momentum. Detectives followed up on more than 100 tips. Rumors of suspicious vehicles, strange men seen near the diner, and anonymous calls claiming to know the killer. But each lead ended in disappointment. The most promising development came from the state crime lab months later. Technicians managed to extract a more complete DNA profile from one of the cigarette butts found near Alyssa's body. It was entered into CODIS, the national DNA database. Investigators held their breath, waiting for a hit. But when the results came back, the database returned empty. The DNA belonged to no one currently known to law enforcement. It was as if the killer had appeared from nowhere, committed the crime, and disappeared back into the crowd. As time passed, the media frenzy faded. The cameras left, the headlines shrank, and the town tried to resume normal life. But beneath the surface, fear lingered. Parents grew more protective of their children. Women avoided driving alone at night. Every unfamiliar face was met with suspicion. And for the Monroe family, life became an endless cycle of grief and unanswered questions. The police, though still committed, were running out of options. Resources dwindled as other cases demanded attention. Files were boxed and archived. Detectives rotated to new assignments. The once burning urgency dimmed into a quiet frustration, leaving Alyssa's case to hover in the realm of the unsolved. And so, by the end of 2007, what had begun with sirens, search parties, and promises of justice became just another cold case. Alyssa Monroe's killer remained unidentified, her family remained without closure, and the community was left to wonder if they had already shaken hands with a murderer without even knowing it. What no one realized then was that the evidence gathered in those early days, the cigarette butts, the tire tracks, the DNA, though useless at the time, would one day become the very key that unlocked the truth. The murder of Alyssa Monroe was not just a crime. It was a wound that cut through the heart of Brookhaven, Illinois. This was the kind of town where neighbors still borrowed sugar from each other, where the postman knew every family by name, and where children rode their bikes freely without parents worrying about their safety. To lose someone so young, so beloved, and in such a violent way shattered the illusion of safety that had defined the community for generations. In the days immediately following the discovery of Alyssa's body, the town came together in ways both heartbreaking and inspiring. Candlelight vigils lit up the steps of Jefferson Elementary, where Alyssa had spent her final days teaching. Students left hand-drawn pictures taped to the school's front doors, stick figures holding hands, rainbows stretching across the sky, hearts scribbled in crayon with Alyssa's name written in shaky letters. Parents hugged their children tightly as they explained, in words far too heavy for young ears, why their teacher would not be coming back. Local churches held prayer services, their pews filled beyond capacity. Ministers spoke of hope, justice, and the resilience of the community, but beneath every sermon lingered a quiet dread. If someone could take Alyssa, then no one was truly safe. The Monroe family became the focal point of the town's grief. Judith and Frank Monroe, though devastated, made public appearances to thank volunteers and plead for information. Standing before microphones, their voices breaking, they begged the killer to come forward or for someone, anyone, to reveal what they knew. Their bravery was admired, but those who knew them privately saw the cracks forming. Judith struggled to sleep, often jolting awake in the night calling out for her daughter. Frank, once a strong and steady man, seemed to age overnight, his shoulders hunched as though carrying an unbearable weight. Media outlets descended on Brookhaven. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes jutting into the sky. Reporters interviewed townspeople outside diners, grocery stores, and gas stations. National networks picked up the story, framing it as yet another example of small-town America haunted by violence. Some journalists painted Alyssa as the perfect victim. Young, kind, a teacher with her entire life ahead of her. While this sympathetic portrayal rallied national attention, it also brought a circus-like atmosphere to a grieving town. Cameras captured every tear, every prayer, every whispered rumor. And rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that Alyssa's boyfriend, Daniel, despite his alibi, knew more than he admitted. Others speculated about strangers seen loitering near the diner, or about men with criminal records who had recently returned to town. Every new theory divided neighbors, sometimes turning suspicion against lifelong friends. For the first time in memory, trust within Brookhaven began to fracture. Businesses also felt the impact. The diner where Alyssa was last seen reported fewer customers as locals grew uneasy about gathering in public places. Parents refused to let their children walk alone, carpooling them to school instead. Late-night outings dwindled and once busy streets grew quiet after dusk. Brookhaven no longer felt like home, it felt like a place where danger lurked unseen. The broader community outside town also rallied. Volunteers from neighboring counties joined searches, handing out missing person flyers in the early days, then later gathering to demand justice once Alyssa's body was found. Online forums dedicated to unsolved crimes picked up her story, with strangers across the country analyzing every detail released by police. Some offered sincere help, while others spread wild conspiracy theories that only added to the confusion. Despite the growing fear, there was also resilience. Teachers at Jefferson Elementary organized a scholarship fund in Alyssa's name, designed to support students who dreamed of becoming educators like her. Local businesses held fundraisers, donating proceeds to the Monroe family. Each act of kindness was a small attempt to reclaim a sense of control in the face of chaos. Still, beneath the public shows of unity, a quiet fear ate away at everyone. Who could have done this? Was the killer someone passing through, or was he still here, smiling, blending in, living among them? Mothers side-eyed strangers in grocery aisles. Fathers double-checked locks at night. Teenagers who once roamed the town freely found themselves grounded by anxious parents. The coldness of the crime, the careful concealment of Alyssa's body, the lack of obvious motive, only deepened the unease. It suggested calculation, not impulse. And calculation meant intelligence. Whoever had killed Alyssa had likely thought it through, had anticipated how to leave so little evidence. That thought terrified the town more than anything else. Months passed, and with each passing season, the case slipped further from daily conversation. Yet, in quiet moments, it remained ever present. An empty chair at the diner, a darkened classroom at Jefferson Elementary, a mother clutching her daughter's picture during Sunday service. These small reminders kept the wound fresh. The shock had evolved into a heavy silence. People avoided speaking of the crime in public, but in private kitchens and living rooms, the whispers never stopped. And in every whisper, one truth echoed: the killer had not been caught. That unspoken fear hardened into something else: resentment. Some residents began blaming law enforcement, accusing them of incompetence or apathy. Others blamed outsiders, convinced that a drifter had brought violence to their quiet town. But the Monroe family held fast to hope, insisting that justice, though delayed, would one day arrive. And they were right. Because though Brookhaven seemed to move on, though the headlines faded and the cameras left, the evidence remained. Buried in police files, sealed in evidence bags, and logged into databases, the truth waited patiently for the day when science, persistence, and fate would finally bring it into the light. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest pain, but in Brookhaven, Illinois, the wound left by Alyssa Monroe's murder never truly healed. Instead, it settled into a deep ache, present in every conversation left unfinished, every milestone she never reached, and every unanswered question that haunted her family and friends. By early 2008, the case that had once dominated headlines slipped quietly into the category police dreaded most: unsolved. Reporters moved on to fresher stories, investigators were reassigned to new crimes, and the bright yellow tape that had once surrounded fields and back roads was long gone. But for the Monroes, nothing had changed. Alyssa was still gone, her killer still free. Judith Monroe, Alyssa's mother, clung to her daughter's memory with a kind of fierce devotion. She kept Alyssa's bedroom exactly as it had been the day she vanished: the quilt neatly folded at the foot of the bed, the bookshelf stacked with journals, the faint scent of lavender candles still lingering. Each morning, Judith sat at the edge of the bed, whispering prayers into the silence. She became an advocate for cold case victims, writing letters to the governor, contacting investigative journalists, and begging the police department to revisit her daughter's file. Her voice, often trembling but relentless, became the only thing keeping Alyssa's story alive in the public's mind. Frank Monroe, her father, suffered in a different way. Once a vibrant man who loved telling stories in his garage while fixing engines, Frank grew quiet. He stopped attending community events, stopped working on cars, and spent long nights sitting in the driveway staring at the empty road. Friends said he seemed aged beyond his years, carrying grief like a weight that bent his back. His heart condition worsened, and though he rarely spoke of it, everyone knew the loss of Alyssa had drained the life from him. Her siblings, Evan and Claire, struggled too. Evan, only 19 at the time of Alyssa's death, turned to alcohol for comfort, numbing himself to avoid the emptiness of losing his sister. Claire, just 16, channeled her grief into art, painting canvases filled with dark skies and lonely roads. Both carried guilt, Evan for not protecting his older sister, Claire for wishing she had spent more time with her before she was taken. The town itself seemed to wear the tragedy like a shadow. For years, whispers followed whenever new faces appeared in Brookhaven. Was that the man from the diner? Could he be the one? Women still avoided driving alone on the county road where Alyssa's car had been found, and parents gave strict curfews to their children. Meanwhile, the case file sat in storage, thick with pages of interviews, lab reports, and photographs. Detectives occasionally dusted it off when new tips came in, but each lead fizzled into disappointment. A truck matching the tire tracks was investigated. False alarm. A man in a nearby county confessed during a drunken night, later proven to be lying. A DNA sample from a burglary suspect raised hope, but ultimately, it was not a match. As the years stretched into half a decade, the story of Alyssa Monroe became less of a headline and more of a cautionary tale. Teachers reminded students to walk in pairs, parents warned daughters to be vigilant, and neighbors muttered about the tragedy whenever the anniversary came around. But beyond that, life pressed forward. New families moved in, children grew up, and the town, though scarred, tried to move on. Yet the Monroe family could not. Every June they gathered at Alyssa's grave, decorating it with sunflowers, her favorite flower. Judith read letters she had written to her daughter, her voice cracking as she asked the same question she had asked for years. Why hasn't anyone been brought to justice? The hardest part was the silence. Silence from the police, who no longer had updates. Silence from the community, who grew weary of dwelling on the past. Silence from the killer, who had vanished without a trace, living perhaps just a few miles away, unnoticed. Technology changed, but for a long time it brought no answers. In the early 2010s, advancements in DNA profiling gave investigators fresh hope. Alyssa's evidence samples were retested with newer, more sensitive equipment. Once again, they were uploaded into the national database. Once again, there was no match. This cycle of hope and disappointment became its own form of torture. For every phone call from the sheriff's office, Judith's heart would leap, only to be crushed when the update ended in the familiar words, "No new leads." Years turned into nearly a decade. By 2016, many in Brookhaven had begun to speak of Alyssa's case in the past tense. Some said it would never be solved. Others suggested the killer had long since left town or even died. But in quiet corners, the Monroe family's determination never wavered. They knew someone was still out there, and they refused to let Alyssa's name fade into obscurity. Unbeknownst to them, science was inching closer to the truth. The DNA collected from those cigarette butts, though useless at the time, sat preserved in evidence storage, waiting for the day when technology would be advanced enough to connect it to a name. And when that day finally came years later, it would shake Brookhaven to its core. For now, though, in those long years of silence, the Monroe family endured what so many victims' families endure: grief without closure, questions without answers, and the unbearable feeling that justice had been placed on pause. And yet, the silence was never truly empty. It was filled with whispers, whispers of suspicion, whispers of fear, whispers that one day the truth would return like a storm long overdue. By the time 2021 arrived, nearly 14 years had passed since the murder of Alyssa Monroe. For many in Brookhaven, her case had become a tragic chapter they spoke of in hushed tones, a story parents told their children to remind them that danger could strike anywhere. But for Judith Monroe, Alyssa's mother, the years had not dulled the pain or the determination. She continued to write letters, to call investigators, to demand answers. Her persistence kept the case alive, even as time worked against her. What no one could have predicted was that science itself would evolve into the town's greatest ally. In the years since Alyssa's death, forensic technology had advanced in ways unimaginable in 2007. DNA testing had grown more precise, able to extract full profiles from fragments once deemed too degraded. And beyond that, a new tool had emerged: genetic genealogy, the process of using consumer DNA databases to identify suspects through family connections. It was this breakthrough that finally breathed life back into Alyssa's case. In the spring of 2021, a newly assigned detective, Detective Laura Simmons, took over cold case reviews for the county. Known for her relentless work ethic, Simmons had built a reputation for refusing to let unsolved cases fade away. When she opened the Monroe file, she was struck by the preservation of key evidence, especially the cigarette butts found near Alyssa's body. They had yielded DNA before, but at the time, no matches were available. Now, Simmons saw an opportunity. She contacted the state crime lab and requested that the DNA be re-examined using the most advanced methods available. The lab agreed, and within weeks, technicians extracted a pristine male DNA profile. It was stronger, clearer, and far more reliable than anything obtained in 2007. This time, instead of uploading it only to Cody's, Simmons worked with a private lab specializing in forensic genealogy. The profile was compared against public DNA databases where millions of people had voluntarily submitted their genetic information to learn about their ancestry. Slowly, painstakingly, the lab built a family tree of possible relatives, narrowing down the branches until one name surfaced with alarming clarity. The suspect was not a stranger to Brookhaven. He was someone the community had known for years. When Simmons received the report, she sat in silence, staring at the name. It was a man who had lived less than 15 miles from the crime scene in 2007. A man who had attended community events, waved to neighbors, and carried on as though nothing had ever happened. He was not on anyone's radar during the original investigation, slipping through unnoticed while suspicion fell on others. But the DNA did not lie. The discovery sent a jolt through the sheriff's department. For years, the case had been stagnant, little more than a painful reminder of failure. Now, for the first time, they had a tangible lead, a suspect backed by science. Simmons and her team began digging into his past, retracing his movements from 2007. They pulled employment records, searched for old police reports, and interviewed people who had known him. Slowly, a disturbing picture emerged. He had a history of violent behavior that had gone largely unnoticed outside of minor incidents: bar fights, harassment complaints, accusations that never stuck. He had been seen at the same diner where Alyssa last ate with Rebecca. He even owned a pickup truck with the exact brand of tires that matched the tracks near the cornfield. Back in 2007, these details had seemed too small, too circumstantial. But now, framed by DNA evidence, they painted a chilling portrait. Detective Simmons knew they had to proceed carefully. After so many years, the community had nearly given up hope. To announce a suspect prematurely could shatter what little trust remained. She pushed for surveillance, building a watertight case before moving forward. Officers collected discarded items, coffee cups, napkins, bottles, from the man's trash. Each time, the DNA matched perfectly with the sample found on the cigarette butts beside Alyssa's body. It was undeniable. 14 years of silence had finally ended with a name. When the sheriff's department gathered to review the evidence, the room was heavy with emotion. Some officers who had worked the original case sat quietly, their eyes wet with tears. Others clenched their fists, angry that justice had been delayed for so long. But all agreed the time had come. For Judith and Frank Monroe, the breakthrough was both a relief and a torment. When detectives visited their home to share the news, Judith wept openly, clutching Alyssa's photograph to her chest. Frank simply nodded, his face pale, his voice trembling as he whispered, "It's about time." After 14 years of waiting, of begging, of wondering if the world had forgotten their daughter, they finally had an answer. News of the development spread quickly. The community, which had long resigned itself to silence, suddenly buzzed with renewed energy. Old fears resurfaced, but so did a determination to see justice served. For the first time in years, Brookhaven dared to hope. The arrest was still to come, but the breakthrough had shattered the years of hopelessness. A killer who had once blended seamlessly into the crowd was about to be unmasked. And when his name was finally made public, the town would reel in shock. Because the man tied to Alyssa Monroe's murder was not an outsider, not a drifter, not a stranger passing through. He was someone they had all known. Someone who had hidden in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. The silence was over. Justice was finally on its way. When Detective Laura Simmons finally traced the DNA to a single individual, the name stunned her. The man tied to Alyssa Monroe's murder was not a shadowy drifter or an unknown predator. He was Richard Hale, a longtime Brookhaven resident whose life had intertwined quietly with the town for decades. At 51 years old, Richard Hale seemed, on the surface, like an ordinary man. He worked as a part-time mechanic at a local auto shop, lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, and was known to attend church services occasionally. His neighbors described him as polite, if somewhat distant. He was not the type of person who drew attention. In a town where gossip traveled faster than the wind, Richard remained invisible, always present but never memorable. But when detectives began peeling back the layers of his life, a darker picture emerged. Richard had grown up in Brookhaven, the son of a factory worker and a homemaker. His childhood was marked by trouble. School records showed frequent disciplinary issues: fights, vandalism, a string of suspensions. As a teenager, he was known to drink heavily and spend late nights with rough crowds. His early 20s brought a series of arrests: bar fights, petty theft, reckless driving. Yet each time, the charges were minor enough to avoid long-term consequences. By the early 2000s, Richard had settled into what looked like a quieter life. He held steady jobs, kept mostly to himself, and avoided major legal trouble. But beneath that surface there were troubling patterns. Women who had dated him described him as controlling and quick-tempered. One former girlfriend told police he had once shoved her against a wall during an argument. Another recalled him stalking her after their breakup, showing up uninvited at her workplace. Yet none of these incidents ever escalated into formal charges. In Brookhaven, Richard remained largely unnoticed. Until 2007. Detectives reviewing his records found that in the summer Alyssa was murdered, Richard had been working irregular hours at the auto shop. On the night Alyssa disappeared, he claimed to have been at home, drinking beer and watching television. At the time, no one had questioned him closely, and without any direct evidence, he slipped under the radar. But the DNA evidence recovered from the cigarette butts left near Alyssa's body told a different story. Richard Hale had been at the crime scene. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered even more disturbing connections. Richard frequented the diner where Alyssa was last seen with her friend Rebecca. Waitresses recalled him sitting alone at the counter, smoking cigarettes and watching people come and go. A few even remembered seeing him there on the very night Alyssa vanished. What chilled detectives most was Richard's proximity to the location where Alyssa's car was found. His house, tucked away behind rows of cornfields, was less than 5 miles from that lonely stretch of county road. He would have known it well: the turns, the dark spots, the places where no one would notice a car pulling over. The more they learned, the clearer it became. Richard Hale had been hiding in plain sight for years. When his name was first shared with the Monroe family, the reaction was one of disbelief. Judith shook her head, unable to reconcile the polite man she had occasionally seen at church with the monster who had taken her daughter. Frank clenched his fists, his voice breaking as he asked, "How could it be him? He lived right here all this time." For Alyssa's siblings, the revelation was chilling. They realized they had likely crossed paths with Richard without ever knowing the truth. The community reacted with equal shock. Richard was not beloved, but neither was he hated. He was one of those people everyone knew vaguely but no one knew well. He had fixed cars for neighbors, bought groceries at the same store, nodded politely at people in town. To imagine that he had committed such a brutal crime, and managed to carry that secret for nearly 15 years, left Brookhaven stunned. As the case against him built, detectives began reconstructing his possible involvement in Alyssa's murder. They believed he had followed her from the diner, waiting for the moment when she would be alone on the quiet county road. He likely forced her car off the side of the road or lured her into stopping, then attacked her. The evidence suggested a struggle: her torn clothing, her injuries, the position of her car seat. Richard had likely overpowered her, killed her, and then dragged her body into the cornfield where he tried to conceal her beneath the brush. The cigarette butts, casual and careless, became the very clue that betrayed him. Investigators theorized that Richard had expected Alyssa's disappearance to remain unsolved, just another mystery fading into time. And for many years he was right. But as technology advanced and persistence endured, his secret unraveled. For Brookhaven, the revelation reignited fear. People wondered how many other crimes Richard might have committed. Had he attacked others? Were there more victims who never came forward? The thought that a man capable of killing Alyssa had lived quietly among them, free and unsuspected, was more disturbing than anything else. Detective Simmons prepared the case file with meticulous care. Surveillance confirmed Richard's current habits: his work schedule, his routines, his interactions. Every piece of evidence was cross-checked. The DNA match, the tire tracks, the diner witnesses, the proximity of his home, all pointed to one undeniable conclusion: Richard Hale was the man who had murdered Alyssa Monroe in 2007. The next step was clear. After nearly a decade and a half of silence, Brookhaven would finally witness justice. The arrest of Richard Hale was imminent, and with it, the town would face the shattering realization that the killer had never been far away. And when the cuffs finally clicked shut, Brookhaven would never look at him, or at their own community, the same way again. On a chilly October morning in 2021, nearly 15 years after Alyssa Monroe's murder, Brookhaven awoke to the news it had long stopped expecting. An arrest had been made. The man at the center of it, Richard Hale, was not some distant stranger or shadowy outsider. He was a neighbor, a mechanic, a familiar face who had walked the same streets as everyone else. And now he was accused of committing the town's darkest crime. The arrest unfolded with precision. Just after dawn, unmarked vehicles rolled quietly into Richard's neighborhood. Officers in tactical gear surrounded his modest house at the end of a gravel road. The sky was still dim, streaked with pale pink as the sun rose. Inside the house, Richard was making coffee when a loud knock echoed through the walls. "Richard Hale, this is the police. Come to the door." Neighbors who later recounted the scene said they saw Richard open the door in a worn flannel shirt, confusion etched across his face. He barely had time to protest before officers grabbed his arms, pulled them behind his back, and snapped the cold steel of handcuffs around his wrists. For a man who had spent years blending into the background, Richard suddenly found himself under the harsh spotlight of justice. As he was let out, flashing lights from squad cars illuminated his stunned expression. Reporters who had been tipped off captured the moment, their cameras clicking furiously. Within hours, Richard Hale's image was broadcast on every local news station, the face of the man accused of murdering beloved schoolteacher Alyssa Monroe. The reaction in Brookhaven was immediate and explosive. Shock gave way to anger. How could someone who lived among them, who fixed their cars, who smiled politely at church, be the monster they had hunted for so long? Some residents admitted they had always found Richard odd, but no one imagined he was capable of murder. For many, the realization was chilling. They had waved at him in passing, stood behind him in grocery store lines, even trusted him with their vehicles, never knowing the secret he carried. For the Monroe family, the arrest was both a relief and a heartbreak. Judith wept when detectives called to confirm the news. She clutched Alyssa's photograph against her chest, whispering, "We did it, Alyssa. We never gave up." Frank, though quieter, broke down for the first time in years. His grief, bottled up for more than a decade, spilled out in tears that left him shaking. For Alyssa's siblings, the news was surreal. Evan said he wanted to see Richard's face in court, to stare into the eyes of the man who had destroyed their family. Claire admitted she felt both joy and fear, joy that justice was finally within reach, fear that the trial might unravel and let him slip away again. As details of the arrest spread, the community gathered at the courthouse where Richard was taken for processing. Crowds lined the sidewalks, holding signs that read "Justice for Alyssa" and "No more silence." Some shouted angrily as Richard was escorted inside, their voices echoing against the stone walls of the building. Others simply stood in stunned silence, watching the man they had known for years now wearing handcuffs. Reporters dug into Richard's past, unearthing stories of bar fights, failed relationships, and whispers of aggression that had been ignored. The narrative painted a picture of a man who had long been troubled, whose darkness had finally come into focus. National networks picked up the story once again, this time framing it as a triumph of modern forensic science. A cold case finally cracked by persistence and technology. But for Brookhaven, it was not just a news story. It was personal. People spoke of sleepless nights, of remembering every interaction they had ever had with Richard, replaying conversations in their minds with new, sinister undertones. Mothers recalled warning their daughters to avoid him without even knowing why. Mechanics who had once worked alongside him now shuddered at the thought of sharing tools with a killer. Richard himself maintained a stony silence. During his initial court appearance, he stood in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles. His eyes darted around the courtroom but never once settled on the Monroe family, who sat in the front row. When the judge read out the charges, first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence, Richard's only response was a quiet, defiant shake of his head. For Judith, hearing those words spoken aloud was both validating and devastating. First-degree murder. The label put into words what she had known all along, but it also reopened the wound of her daughter's violent end. Frank squeezed her hand tightly, whispering that this was the first step toward closure. The arrest sparked renewed discussion across Illinois about cold cases. Law enforcement agencies praised the use of genetic genealogy, calling it a game-changer in solving crimes once thought unsolvable. Citizens debated privacy concerns, but most agreed that the technology had given Brookhaven what it needed most: answers. Yet beneath the celebration lingered an unsettling truth. For nearly 15 years, Richard Hale had lived freely among them. He had walked the same aisles in grocery stores, sat in the same pews at church, and driven the same roads where Alyssa had taken her last breath. The idea that justice had taken so long was as haunting as the crime itself. Still, for the first time in over a decade, Brookhaven felt a shift. The heavy silence that had defined the years after Alyssa's death was breaking apart. People dared to hope again, dared to believe that closure was possible. The town gathered once more at Jefferson Elementary, where students and teachers lit candles and placed flowers beneath Alyssa's memorial plaque. This time the vigil was different. It was not just about mourning, it was about victory, however delayed. The trial was still ahead, and the road to justice promised to be long and painful. But with Richard Hale in custody, the people of Brookhaven finally felt that the nightmare was nearing its end. And as Richard sat alone in his cell that night, the weight of years of silence pressing down on him, one thing became clear: the mask he had worn for so long had finally shattered. The town that once overlooked him now saw him for what he truly was: the killer of Alyssa Monroe. The trial of Richard Hale began in the spring of 2022, drawing crowds that filled every seat in the small county courthouse. For nearly 15 years, the people of Brookhaven had lived with whispers, suspicions, and unanswered questions. Now at last they gathered to witness justice unfold. The courtroom became both a stage and a sanctuary, where the community's grief, anger, and hope converged in a single pursuit: the truth. From the very first day, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters crowded outside, their cameras flashing as Richard was led into the building in shackles. Inside, the Monroe family sat in the front row, their faces etched with quiet determination. Judith clutched a photo of Alyssa, refusing to let her daughter's memory be overshadowed by the man accused of taking her life. Frank, though frail and visibly aged, sat upright, his eyes fixed on Richard with a steady, unyielding glare. Evan and Claire, Alyssa's siblings, flanked their parents, ready to speak if called upon. The prosecution's case was meticulous. They began with the story everyone knew: Alyssa's disappearance in 2007, the discovery of her car abandoned by the county road, and the horrific discovery of her body days later in the cornfield. They showed photographs of the crime scene, grainy images of Alyssa's belongings scattered in her car, the tire tracks pressed into the soil, and the brush where her body had been concealed. The room fell silent as jurors studied the images, the weight of the crime settling heavily over them. Then came the science. Expert witnesses explained how DNA preserved on cigarette butts found near Alyssa's body had finally led to Richard Hale. The jury listened intently as forensic genealogists described the painstaking process of tracing the DNA through family trees, narrowing down suspects, and confirming the match with samples taken from Richard's discarded trash. The conclusion was inescapable: Richard's DNA was at the crime scene, mere feet from Alyssa's body. The prosecution also called on witnesses from 2007. Rebecca Lawson, Alyssa's friend, who had last seen her at the diner. Rebecca's voice trembled as she recalled Alyssa waving goodnight, never imagining it would be the last time. A waitress from the diner testified that she had seen Richard there that evening, sitting alone and watching others. Another witness described seeing a truck matching Richard's near the county road around the time Alyssa vanished. Piece by piece, the prosecution wove a chilling narrative. Richard Hale had stalked Alyssa, followed her from the diner, and attacked her on the desolate road. They argued that he had killed her with blunt force, left her body hidden in the cornfield, and carried on with his life as though nothing had happened. The most damning evidence was his proximity, his home just miles from the crime scene, and the DNA that tied him unmistakably to the cigarettes left behind. The defense fought desperately to create doubt. Richard's attorney argued that DNA alone could not prove murder, that Richard might have been in the area at some other time, that someone else could have killed Alyssa, and that the case was built on circumstantial evidence. They painted Richard as a flawed but harmless man, insisting he had been targeted because the community needed someone to blame. Richard himself took the stand briefly, maintaining his innocence in a flat, emotionless tone. "I didn't kill her," he repeated, his eyes downcast. But the words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. For the Monroe family, the most difficult moments came during victim impact testimonies. Judith took the stand, her hands trembling as she spoke about the daughter she had lost. She described Alyssa's love for teaching, her laughter, her dreams of seeing the world. Her voice broke as she turned to Richard and said, "You stole more than a life. You stole our future with her." Frank followed, his voice gravelly, recounting the years of silence and grief. Evan spoke of losing his protector, the sister who always looked out for him. Claire, now an adult, described the emptiness of growing up without Alyssa by her side. Each testimony left jurors visibly moved, some wiping tears from their eyes. After weeks of testimony, the trial reached its climax. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful. "The evidence does not whisper his guilt, it shouts it. Richard Hale lived among you, hiding in plain sight, while this family suffered for 15 years. Do not let him escape justice again." The defense countered, but their words seemed thin compared to the emotional weight of the case. When the jury retired to deliberate, the entire courthouse held its breath. Hours passed. Families waited in tense silence. Finally, the jury filed back in, their faces solemn. The foreperson rose, the room silent enough to hear the faint ticking of the courtroom clock. The verdict: guilty on all counts. Gasps echoed through the room. Judith collapsed into tears, clutching Claire. Frank closed his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer. The jurors, though composed, looked shaken, as if the weight of their decision lingered heavily on their shoulders. Richard Hale stood motionless, his face pale, his expression unreadable. The judge sentenced Richard to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence ensured he would never again walk the streets of Brookhaven, never again sit quietly at the diner, never again hide in plain sight. For the Monroe family, it was a measure of justice, too late to bring Alyssa back, but enough to honor her memory. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered once more, this time with a sense of relief. People hugged, cried, and placed flowers at Alyssa's memorial. The town that had lived in fear for so long finally felt the grip of the past begin to loosen. For Judith and Frank, justice was bittersweet. Nothing could fill the void Alyssa left behind, but knowing her killer would never harm another soul brought a measure of peace. As Judith told reporters, her voice steady despite her tears, "This verdict does not heal us, but it means Alyssa can finally rest." And for Brookhaven, the trial of Richard Hale became more than a courtroom drama. It was a lesson in patience, persistence, and the power of truth to outlast silence. When the gavel fell and Richard Hale was sentenced to life in prison without parole, a collective sigh seemed to ripple through Brookhaven, Illinois. For 15 years, the town had lived under the shadow of Alyssa Monroe's murder, haunted by unanswered questions, gnawed by the fear that her killer might never be found. Now at last justice had been served. And yet, even with Richard locked away, the aftermath revealed that closure was more complicated than a single verdict. For the Monroe family, the trial's conclusion marked both an ending and a beginning. Judith Monroe, Alyssa's mother, stood outside the courthouse with tears streaming down her face. Surrounded by reporters, she spoke softly, "Justice came too late, but it came." Alyssa's voice was silenced, but today, it was heard again. In her hands, she carried the same framed photograph she had brought to every vigil and hearing. To her, Alyssa was not just a victim in a file, she was still her daughter, the girl with the bright smile and the love for teaching. Frank Monroe, Alyssa's father, had aged visibly through the years of grief. The trial took a toll on his already fragile health, yet he carried himself with quiet strength. For Frank, the guilty verdict was less about celebration and more about release. He had spent countless nights replaying what-ifs, wondering if he could have protected his daughter somehow. Now, knowing Richard would never harm anyone again, Frank felt a small measure of peace. "It's not closure," he told a local reporter, "because closure doesn't exist when you lose a child. But it's justice. And that matters." Alyssa's siblings, Evan and Claire, processed the outcome in their own ways. Evan, who had drowned much of his pain in alcohol in the early years, spoke publicly about channeling his grief into advocacy for cold case victims. Claire, whose art had once been filled with shadows and sorrow, painted a mural in Alyssa's honor on the side of Jefferson Elementary School. It depicted a field of sunflowers stretching toward a bright sky, Alyssa's favorite flower reaching toward the light. The mural became a symbol not just of loss, but of resilience. For the town of Brookhaven, the case left a permanent scar. People who had once trusted their neighbors without question now admitted that the crime changed the way they saw the world. The idea that Richard Hale had lived among them for so long, sharing pews in church, fixing their cars, buying groceries from the same stores, was chilling. It reminded everyone that evil does not always come wearing a mask. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, wearing the face of someone ordinary. Yet out of that fear grew a renewed sense of unity. Vigils turned into annual remembrance ceremonies, where the town gathered not just to honor Alyssa, but to support other families living with unanswered questions. Teachers at Jefferson Elementary continued the scholarship fund in Alyssa's name, ensuring her passion for education lived on through generations of students. The case also reshaped how law enforcement in Illinois approached unsolved crimes. The use of forensic genealogy, once a new and untested tool, proved its worth in Alyssa's case. Other counties began reopening their cold cases, inspired by the Monroe family's persistence and the breakthrough that finally brought Richard Hale to justice. Alyssa's story became a rallying cry: never give up, because the truth can still be found, even after years of silence. But perhaps the most profound impact was personal. For those who had known Alyssa, the children she taught, the friends she laughed with, the family who loved her, the verdict was not the end of her story. Instead, it became a reminder of the importance of carrying her spirit forward. Rebecca Lawson, Alyssa's best friend, visited her grave often in the months after the trial. Standing among the flowers, she would speak aloud as if Alyssa could still hear her. "You mattered," she whispered once, placing a sunflower on the headstone. "And now everyone knows it." As the seasons changed, Brookhaven began to heal. The county road where Alyssa's car was found became less of a place of fear and more of a place of remembrance. Each June, on the anniversary of her disappearance, townspeople placed sunflowers along the roadside, turning the once dark stretch into a ribbon of gold. For a moment, the community reclaimed the place that had symbolized tragedy, transforming it into a tribute to her life. Still, the case left behind difficult questions about justice delayed, about the cost of silence, about the fragility of safety in even the smallest towns. Parents continued to warn their children, neighbors still cast wary glances, and no one in Brookhaven ever forgot the name Richard Hale. But alongside that name, one name rose stronger: Alyssa Monroe. Her story became more than the tale of a life cut short. It became a testament to the power of persistence, to the advances of science, and to the unwavering love of a family that refused to let her be forgotten. In the end, Alyssa's legacy was not defined by Richard Hale's crime. It was defined by the light she left behind, the lives she touched as a teacher, the love she gave as a daughter and sister, and the unity her memory inspired in her town. Justice had taken 14 years, but it had come. And though the wound would never fully heal, Brookhaven learned to live with it, carrying Alyssa's memory not as a burden, but as a guiding light. Because some stories do not end with silence. Some stories demand to be told again and again until the truth is finally heard. And in Brookhaven, Illinois, the story of Alyssa Monroe would forever echo as a reminder. Justice may sleep, but it never dies.